In my 2 decades investigating violent crimes, I've never encountered a case that haunts me like Lisa Anderson's. January 12, 2024. A 26-year-old entrepreneur unlocks her clothing boutique for what should be another ordinary day. 2 men enter posing as customers, but they're not there to buy anything. They've been paid $5,000 to ensure Lisa never sees another sunset. 25 stab wounds later, they lock her inside and walk away, convinced their job is done. But what they didn't know was that Lisa Anderson refuses to die quietly. The question that still keeps me awake at night: how does someone survive what was designed to be the perfect murder? Subscribe to this channel, because Lisa's story reveals the chilling truth about how people we trust most can become our deadliest enemies. January 12, 2024. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Cedar Falls, a small town where everyone knew everyone, and secrets were supposed to stay buried. Lisa Anderson pushed open the glass door of her clothing boutique with the same enthusiasm she'd carried every day since opening 6 months earlier. At 26, she had the kind of infectious smile that made customers linger just a little longer, made them feel like they were visiting a friend rather than just shopping for clothes. She had no way of knowing that 2 men were already watching her from across the street. 2 men who had driven 3 hours that morning with a very specific purpose. 2 men who weren't there to buy anything at all. The investigator in me has worked hundreds of cases over the years, but there's something about Lisa's story that still keeps me awake at night. Maybe it's because she survived to tell it herself. Maybe it's because what happened to her was so calculated, so methodical, that it shakes your faith in the basic goodness of people. Or maybe it's because when you dig deep enough into this case, you realize that the 2 people she trusted most in the world had been planning her death for weeks. Lisa wasn't originally from Cedar Falls. She'd grown up 4 hours south in the tiny farming community of Millbrook, population barely 3,000, where her mother Sarah had raised 3 children on a teacher's salary while harboring dreams that were bigger than the town limits. Sarah Anderson was the daughter of a wheat farmer, one of 3 siblings, and the only one who'd made it to college. She'd clawed her way through a teaching degree with a determination that bordered on obsession, and she'd passed that same fierce ambition down to her children like a family heirloom. The plan was simple. All 3 Anderson kids would get their degrees, would rise above the dusty fields and economic uncertainty that had defined their family for generations. Lisa's older sister, Emma, had already graduated with a degree in industrial engineering. Her younger brother, Marcus, was finishing dental school. Lisa was studying nursing, drawn to the profession by something deeper than ambition. She genuinely loved taking care of people, had a natural instinct for comfort that made her a magnet for anyone who needed help. But nursing school in Cedar Falls was expensive, and Lisa needed to work. That's how she ended up at the dental clinic downtown, filing paperwork and greeting patients with that same warm smile that would later make her such a successful business owner. It was there, in the sterile waiting room of Cedar Valley Dental, that she first met Stella Cunningham. Stella was different from the other employees. Where the dental hygienists and assistants carried themselves with professional distance, Stella had a raw authenticity that Lisa found compelling. She'd grown up in the roughest part of Cedar Falls, in a neighborhood where the houses leaned against each other like tired old men, where families struggled to keep the lights on, and children learned early that life didn't owe them anything. Stella's father had worked construction when his back allowed it, but years of heavy lifting and hard living had taken their toll. When Lisa met her, Stella carried stories of real hardship, the kind that made Lisa's small-town upbringing seem sheltered by comparison. The friendship developed slowly at first, the way workplace relationships do. Coffee breaks stretched into longer conversations. Stella would stay after work sometimes, and the 2 women would sit in the empty waiting room talking about their dreams, their fears, their plans for the future. There was something magnetic about Stella's honesty, the way she talked about poverty and struggle without self-pity, with a matter-of-fact toughness that Lisa admired. When Lisa's birthday approached in 2021, she made a decision that would later seem like the first domino falling in a chain reaction she never could have predicted. She invited Stella to come home with her to Millbrook for the celebration. It was a 4-hour drive through farmland and small towns, and during that drive something shifted in their friendship. They were no longer just work colleagues who got along well. They were becoming real friends, the kind who shared secrets and made plans together. The party was exactly what you'd expect from a small farming town celebration. Lisa's mother had strung lights in the backyard, relatives had driven in from neighboring counties, and there was a sense of family warmth that Stella had rarely experienced. The photo that would later circulate widely on social media showed the two young women in the swimming pool, arms around each other's shoulders, both laughing at something just outside the camera's frame. They looked like sisters, like best friends, like people who would always have each other's backs. But even then, if you knew what to look for, there were signs. The way Stella's smile never quite reached her eyes in group photos, the way she seemed to be studying Lisa's family, cataloguing their closeness, their easy affection, their comfortable middle-class stability. Years later, when investigators would comb through social media posts and text messages, they'd find evidence that Stella was already feeling something darker than friendship, something that looked more like envy, something that was slowly transforming into resentment. After the birthday celebration, the two women returned to Cedar Falls and continued working together, but their dynamic had changed. They were closer now, sharing more personal details, making plans for the future. Lisa had no way of knowing that she was providing Stella with a roadmap, showing her exactly what kind of life she wanted for herself, a life that, in Stella's mind, Lisa didn't deserve. It was around this time that Stella began dating Dr. Jonathan Mitchell, a dentist who had recently moved to town to establish his own practice. Jonathan was ambitious, charming in a calculated way, and absolutely ruthless when it came to getting what he wanted. He and Stella were perfect for each other in the worst possible way. Both had grown up with less than they wanted. Both had developed a talent for manipulation disguised as charm. Both were willing to do whatever it took to get ahead. Their relationship moved fast, faster than seemed natural to the people who knew them. Within months of their first date, they were talking about opening a dental practice together. Stella would handle the business side, Jonathan would provide the medical expertise, and together they'd build the kind of successful professional partnership that would lift them both out of their circumstances. But there was a problem. Starting a dental practice required significant capital, and neither Stella nor Jonathan had the kind of money they needed. They applied for loans, courted investors, and explored every legitimate avenue they could think of. But legitimate avenues have a way of closing when your credit isn't perfect, and your business plan relies more on ambition than experience. That's when they began looking at less legitimate options. That's when they started talking about Lisa. Lisa, meanwhile, was focused on her studies and working to make ends meet. When Stella and Jonathan announced they were opening their own practice, she was genuinely happy for them. When they posted on social media about their new venture, Lisa was one of the first to comment with congratulations and heart emojis. She had no idea that her name was already being discussed in late-night conversations between the couple, conversations that would eventually lead to the morning of January 12, 2024. The new dental practice, Cedar Valley Smiles, opened with great fanfare. Stella handled marketing and patient relations with the same raw charisma that had first drawn Lisa to her. Jonathan provided the clinical expertise, working long hours to build a patient base and establish the practice's reputation. On the surface, everything looked perfect. They were the young professional couple making their dreams come true through hard work and determination. But beneath the surface, financial pressures were mounting. Equipment payments, rent, staff salaries, insurance premiums, the costs of running a dental practice were crushing them. They needed help, and they needed it fast. When a receptionist position opened up, Stella knew exactly who to call. Lisa had been looking for work anyway. Her nursing studies were on hold due to financial constraints, and she needed steady employment to get back on track. When Stella reached out through Instagram, offering her a full-time position at the new practice, it seemed like the answer to her prayers. 20 days had passed since Lisa had submitted her resume with no response, and she'd assumed they'd found someone else. Stella's sudden interest seemed like a sign that things were finally looking up. The job interview was more of a formality. Lisa and Stella were friends, after all, and Stella had already convinced Jonathan that Lisa would be perfect for the position. She was reliable, friendly, had previous experience in dental offices, and most importantly, she trusted Stella completely. That trust would prove to be both her greatest asset and her most dangerous vulnerability. For 50 days, Lisa worked as the receptionist at Cedar Valley Smiles. She arrived early, stayed late when needed, and brought the same enthusiasm to the job that she brought to everything else in her life. Patients loved her. commenting frequently on her warm demeanor and genuine interest in their well-being. She was exactly the kind of employee every business owner dreams of having. During quiet moments between appointments, Lisa and Stella would talk the way they always had. Stella was pregnant now, showing just enough that she'd started wearing looser clothing, and she often sat with Lisa at the reception desk during slow periods. They'd discuss baby names, nursery decorations, and Stella's concerns about balancing motherhood with running a business. To anyone watching, they looked like two friends supporting each other through life's transitions. But when Jonathan was around, the dynamic shifted. He maintained a professional distance from Lisa that bordered on coldness, treating her more like a piece of office equipment than a person. She found this strange, given that Stella spoke about him with such warmth, but she attributed it to his serious nature and the pressure of running a new business. She had no way of knowing that Jonathan saw her as something else entirely. He saw her as a problem to be solved. The practice was hemorrhaging money faster than they could bring it in. Despite a growing patient base and positive reviews, the overhead costs were crushing them. They'd borrowed against everything they owned, maxed out credit cards and taken advances against future earnings. They were 3 months behind on equipment leases, 2 months behind on rent, and facing the very real possibility that their dream would collapse before it had a chance to succeed. That's when the conversations between Stella and Jonathan took a darker turn. That's when they started talking about Lisa, not just as an employee, but as a solution to their problems. Lisa had mentioned her small inheritance from her grandmother, the money she'd used to eventually open her own clothing boutique. She'd talked about her mother's middle-class stability, her family's modest but reliable income. To Stella and Jonathan, desperate and facing financial ruin, Lisa represented something they needed desperately: money. But it wasn't just about the money. It was about something deeper and more disturbing. Stella had been watching Lisa for 3 years now, studying her happiness, her family relationships, her easy confidence in the world. She'd seen Lisa succeed where she herself had struggled, watched her navigate challenges with a support system that Stella had never had. What had started as friendship had curdled into something much darker. Lisa left the dental practice after 50 days, not because of any conflict, but because she'd saved enough money to pursue her real dream, opening her own business. She'd found a small retail space downtown, signed a lease, and spent weeks setting up Bella's Boutique, a women's clothing store that reflected her personal style and business instincts. The grand opening had been a success, with friends and family showing up to support her new venture. Even Stella and Jonathan had stopped by, all smiles and congratulations, giving no indication of what they were really thinking, because by then they weren't just thinking about Lisa as a friend or former employee. They were thinking about her as a target. The plan they developed over the following weeks was as methodical as it was chilling. They would hire professional killers, men who could do the job quickly and disappear before anyone knew what had happened. They would make it look like a robbery gone wrong, the kind of random crime that happens to small business owners who keep cash on the premises. Lisa would become another statistic, another tragic story of a young entrepreneur whose dreams were cut short by violence. But they made one crucial mistake in their planning. They underestimated Lisa Anderson. They underestimated her strength, her will to live, and her ability to survive something that should have killed her. They thought they were planning a murder, but what they were actually planning was their own downfall, because Lisa would survive. And survivors, as any investigator will tell you, make the best witnesses. The morning of January 12th, 2024, started like any other day for Lisa. She woke up in her small apartment, made coffee, checked her phone for messages, and got ready for another day at the boutique. She had no way of knowing that 2 men were already on the road from a neighboring state, driving towards Cedar Falls, with her name and address written on a piece of paper. She had no way of knowing that her former friend and former boss had paid these men to ensure she would never see another sunset. As she unlocked the doors to Bella's Boutique that morning, Lisa was thinking about inventory she needed to order, about a marketing campaign she wanted to launch, about the bright future she was building one day at a time. She was thinking about anything except the possibility that the next few hours would test every ounce of strength and determination she'd inherited from her mother's side of the family. But somewhere across town, 2 men were checking their weapons and reviewing the plan they'd been given. Somewhere across town, Stella was probably checking her phone, waiting for confirmation that the problem of Lisa Anderson had been permanently solved. What none of them realized was that they were about to discover just how wrong they could be about someone they thought they knew. The story of what happened next would become the kind of case that investigators discuss for years afterward, the kind that makes you question everything you think you know about human nature. It's a story about friendship and betrayal, about desperation and greed, about the thin line between victim and survivor, and it all started with the simple act of unlocking a door on what should have been just another ordinary morning. But to understand how two people could plan something so horrific, you need to know what happened in the months leading up to that January morning. You need to understand how a friendship built on trust slowly transformed into something much darker. You need to see how financial desperation and buried resentments created the perfect storm that would nearly cost Lisa her life. The warning signs were there from the beginning, if you knew what to look for. During those 50 days Lisa worked at Cedar Valley Smiles, there were moments when the mask slipped, revealing glimpses of who Stella and Jonathan really were beneath their professional facades. Moments that, in retrospect, should have sent Lisa running. The first red flag appeared during what should have been routine dental work. Lisa had needed some maintenance on her braces, work that had been started at the original clinic where she'd first met Stella. When she asked Stella if Jonathan could take care of it, Stella's response was strange, almost panicked. She insisted that Lisa couldn't mention their friendship when she came in as a patient, couldn't let Jonathan know that she was the same person who had visited Stella's hometown for that birthday celebration years earlier. The reason, Stella explained, was jealousy. Jonathan had become obsessed with that trip to Millbrook, fixated on the idea that Stella had been unfaithful during their weekend away. It was irrational, controlling behavior, but Stella seemed genuinely afraid of triggering his anger. She begged Lisa to pretend they barely knew each other, to act like strangers meeting for the first time. The first red flag appeared during what should have been routine dental work. Lisa had needed some maintenance on her braces, work that had been started at the original clinic where she'd first met Stella. When she asked Stella if Jonathan could take care of it, Stella's response was strange, almost panicked. She insisted that Lisa couldn't mention their friendship when she came in as a patient, couldn't let Jonathan know that she was the same person who had visited Stella's hometown for that birthday celebration years earlier. The reason, Stella explained, was jealousy. Jonathan had become obsessed with that trip to Millbrook, fixated on the idea that Stella had been unfaithful during their weekend away. It was irrational, controlling behavior, but Stella seemed genuinely afraid of triggering his anger. She begged Lisa to pretend they barely knew each other, to act like strangers meeting for the first time. Lisa agreed, of course. She was a loyal friend, and if keeping quiet about their relationship would help Stella avoid problems at home, she was happy to play along. But even then, something about the request bothered her. What kind of man demanded to know every detail of his girlfriend's past? What kind of relationship required that level of secrecy and deception? She got her answer during those 50 days at Cedar Valley Smiles. Whenever Jonathan entered the reception area while Lisa and Stella were talking, Stella would immediately stop mid-sentence, her entire demeanor changing from relaxed and friendly to tense and hypervigilant. It was like watching someone flip a switch, transforming from a confident businesswoman into someone who seemed constantly afraid of saying the wrong thing. The conversations would die instantly, replaced by an awkward silence that seemed to fill the entire waiting room. Lisa would try to continue whatever they'd been discussing, but Stella would give her sharp looks, subtle head shakes, anything to signal that the conversation needed to end immediately. It was clear that Jonathan's presence changed everything, that Stella lived in constant fear of his disapproval. But there were other warning signs too, signs that spoke to something even more disturbing than a controlling relationship. During quiet moments at the clinic, when patients were sparse and the phones weren't ringing, Stella would tell stories about her business strategies that revealed a vindictive streak Lisa had never seen before. The most troubling involved their former employer, the dental clinic where Lisa and Stella had first met. When Cedar Valley Smiles opened, it represented direct competition to the established practice, and the original clinic's owner had responded by hiring people to distribute flyers near Stella and Jonathan's new location. It was standard business competition, the kind of thing that happens when new enterprises enter established markets. But Stella's reaction was anything but standard. Instead of focusing on providing better service or competitive pricing, she'd hired her own distributor with explicit instructions to walk directly into the competing clinic and hand out Cedar Valley Smiles promotional materials to patients sitting in the waiting room. It was aggressive, unprofessional, and designed specifically to humiliate her former boss in front of customers. When Stella told this story, her eyes lit up with a satisfaction that made Lisa uncomfortable. This wasn't the same person she'd befriended years earlier, the woman who'd seemed grateful just to have steady employment and a reliable friendship. This was someone who took genuine pleasure in revenge, who saw business competition as personal warfare. Lisa tried to rationalize it away. Starting a new business was stressful, she told herself. People sometimes acted out of character when they felt threatened or overwhelmed. Maybe Stella was just trying to prove herself in a competitive market. Maybe she'd learned to channel that energy more productively as the practice became established. But the rationalization became harder to maintain as the weeks went on. By the time Stella was visibly pregnant and spending more time at the reception desk during slow periods, Lisa could see that something fundamental had changed in her friend. The warmth was still there, but it was increasingly overshadowed by something colder, something calculating. Stella had begun asking questions that felt less like friendly conversation and more like reconnaissance. She wanted to know about Lisa's family finances, her mother's retirement plans, her inheritance from her grandmother. She'd probe for details about Lisa's apartment, her car payments, her student loans. At the time, Lisa assumed Stella was just being a concerned friend, maybe even considering offering financial advice or support. She had no way of knowing that every piece of information was being filed away, that Stella and Jonathan were building a comprehensive picture of Lisa's financial situation for reasons that had nothing to do with friendship. The pregnancy gave Stella a convenient excuse to spend more time sitting down, more time engaging in these probing conversations. She'd complain about fatigue, about morning sickness, about the challenges of running a business while dealing with the physical demands of pregnancy. Lisa, naturally sympathetic, would offer to take on additional responsibilities, would encourage Stella to rest when she needed to. Looking back, investigators would recognize this period as crucial to understanding what happened next. This was when Stella and Jonathan were conducting their own private investigation into Lisa's life, gathering intelligence they would later use to justify their actions. This was when they were learning exactly how much money Lisa had access to, exactly how her family financial structure worked, exactly what they stood to gain if something happened to her. But Lisa saw none of this. She saw a pregnant friend who needed support, a small business owner dealing with the stress of new entrepreneurship, a woman trying to balance personal and professional responsibilities. When Stella announced she'd need to take maternity leave, Lisa was genuinely concerned about how the practice would manage without her. The dynamic changed dramatically once Stella went on leave. Without her buffer, Lisa found herself dealing directly with Jonathan on a daily basis, and the experience was like interacting with a completely different person than the one Stella had described at home. Where Stella had painted him as ambitious but caring, Lisa discovered someone who was cold, dismissive, and occasionally cruel in his treatment of employees. Jonathan had what Lisa would later describe as an arrogance that seemed to fill every room he entered. He treated the staff like servants rather than colleagues, spoke to patients with barely concealed impatience, and made it clear that he considered himself superior to everyone around him. The other dentists who rented space in the practice walked on eggshells around him, careful not to trigger his frequent outbursts of temper. With Lisa, his attitude was particularly harsh. He'd bark orders without explanation, criticize her work publicly in front of patients, and make unreasonable demands about scheduling and administrative tasks. When equipment went missing or procedures didn't go according to plan, his first instinct was always to blame the support staff, regardless of whether they had anything to do with the problem. Lisa tried to maintain her professionalism, reminding herself that Stella had warned her about Jonathan's difficult personality. She told herself that he was under pressure, that running a new practice was stressful, that his behavior would probably improve once things settled down. She had no way of knowing that his treatment of her was entirely intentional, designed to make her working life miserable enough that she'd eventually quit. Because by then, Stella and Jonathan had already decided that Lisa represented both a problem and an opportunity. They'd done the math on their financial situation, and the numbers were devastating. The practice was bleeding money faster than they could generate revenue, their personal expenses were mounting, and the debt they'd accumulated to start the business was crushing them under its weight. They needed a solution, and Lisa had unknowingly provided them with one. Through those careful conversations, Stella had learned that Lisa's family had modest but stable financial resources. Her mother's teacher's pension, her siblings' professional salaries, her own small inheritance and business savings, taken together, it represented more money than Stella and Jonathan had ever had access to. But getting access to that money would require drastic action. It would require making Lisa's family desperate enough to pay anything to get her back. It would require putting her in a situation where money became secondary to survival. The plan they developed was as cold-blooded as it was calculated. They would have Lisa killed, but not immediately. First, they would create a paper trail that made them look like innocent former employers who'd been forced to make difficult business decisions. They would fire her in a way that seemed legitimate, then string out the legal proceedings to establish distance between the termination and what came next. When Jonathan finally called Lisa into his office that afternoon in late September, she had no idea she was walking into the first phase of a murder plot. She'd asked Stella about getting an advance on her next paycheck to cover rent, a perfectly reasonable request that employees make all the time. Instead of a simple yes or no answer, she got summoned to a meeting that would change everything. Jonathan's performance that day was masterful in its cruelty. He started with false sympathy, thanking Lisa for her hard work and acknowledging her dedication to the practice. Then came the supposed bad news. Financial difficulties were forcing them to reduce staff, and unfortunately, Lisa's position was being eliminated. It was a lie, of course. The practice was struggling financially, but Lisa's modest salary wasn't going to make or break their budget. They could have easily kept her on, could have found other ways to cut costs. But keeping her employed didn't serve their larger purpose. The conversation took a darker turn when Jonathan added an unnecessary cruelty to the proceedings. After explaining the supposed business reasons for her termination, he made it clear that her employment had been nothing more than a favor to Stella during her pregnancy. Lisa hadn't been hired because she was qualified or because they needed her skills. She'd been hired as temporary help, a placeholder to cover Stella's maternity leave. The comment was designed to humiliate and isolate Lisa, to make her feel foolish for believing that her friendship with Stella had been genuine. It was psychological warfare disguised as a business meeting, a calculated attempt to damage her self-esteem and make her doubt her own perceptions. Lisa left that meeting feeling confused and hurt, but not suspicious. She assumed that financial pressure had forced difficult decisions, that Jonathan's harsh delivery was just his typically poor communication style. She had no way of knowing that every word had been carefully planned, that the entire termination had been orchestrated as the first step in a much larger scheme. The next phase involved deliberately mishandling her final paycheck. When Lisa came to collect her termination pay, she discovered that they were offering her only $420, a fraction of what she was legally owed under labor law. It wasn't an accounting error or an oversight. It was a deliberate attempt to force her into legal action. Lisa's natural inclination was to resolve the issue quietly and professionally. She'd worked in business settings before. She understood that mistakes happened, and she was willing to give Stella and Jonathan the benefit of the doubt. When she brought her lawyer to the meeting to clarify the legal requirements, she was hoping to educate them about proper termination procedures, not to threaten or intimidate them. But Jonathan's reaction to the lawyer's presence revealed something much darker than simple ignorance about employment law. He became aggressive, defensive, almost hostile to the idea that Lisa might know her rights or insist on proper treatment. When the lawyer explained the legal requirements for termination pay, Jonathan's response was to become even more confrontational, as if Lisa's insistence on fair treatment was somehow a personal attack. The meeting ended with Jonathan promising to look into the situation and get back to them. But weeks passed without any communication. Lisa waited patiently, not wanting to escalate the situation unnecessarily. She understood that Stella was dealing with a new baby, that the practice was under financial stress, that everyone was probably overwhelmed with other priorities, but the silence was intentional. Stella and Jonathan weren't researching employment law or consulting with their accountant. They were letting time pass deliberately, creating distance between the workplace conflict and what they planned to do next. They were establishing a narrative that would later allow them to claim surprise and innocence when investigators started asking questions. When Lisa finally filed a lawsuit in November, 3 months after her termination, she was asking for $3,000, barely enough to cover what she was legally owed, plus modest compensation for the stress and inconvenience of having to pursue legal action. It was a reasonable settlement demand, the kind that most businesses would pay without hesitation to avoid the cost and uncertainty of litigation. But for Stella and Jonathan, that lawsuit represented something much more threatening than a $3,000 expense. It represented exposure, scrutiny, the possibility that investigators might start looking closely at their business practices and financial situation. It represented the kind of attention they couldn't afford, while they were planning something that would require them to maintain perfect cover stories. Most importantly, it gave them a motive that would satisfy investigators after Lisa was found dead. A disgruntled former employee who'd filed a lawsuit against her former employers. It was exactly the kind of scenario that would make police look for random killers rather than suspects with personal connections to the victim. They began reaching out to people who could help them solve their Lisa problem permanently. They made inquiries through intermediaries, asked careful questions about services that couldn't be discussed openly. They researched methods, considered timing, evaluated risks, and through it all, Lisa continued living her normal life, focused on building her clothing boutique and moving forward with her dreams. She had no idea that two people she'd trusted were spending their evenings planning her death, calculating how much money they might inherit or extort after she was gone, discussing the details of making her disappear forever. The investigators working this case would later describe it as one of the most premeditated murders they'd ever encountered. Every detail had been planned weeks in advance, every possible contingency considered. Stella and Jonathan had created what they thought was the perfect crime, a scenario where they would benefit financially from Lisa's death while maintaining complete deniability about their involvement. But they made one crucial error in their planning. They assumed that professional killers would be professional enough to finish the job quickly and cleanly. They assumed that Lisa would be found days later, clearly dead, with no possibility of survival or testimony. They had no way of knowing that Lisa Anderson was much stronger than they'd realized. They had no way of knowing that she would fight for her life with a determination that would ultimately lead to their downfall. As January 12, 2024 approached, everything was in place. The killers had been hired, the plan had been finalized, and Stella and Jonathan were prepared to act surprised and devastated when news of Lisa's death reached them. They probably spent that morning checking their phones, waiting for confirmation that their problem had been solved permanently. But what they were about to discover was that some people refuse to die quietly. Some people fight back with everything they have, and some people survive to tell the truth about what really happened to them. Lisa Anderson was about to become one of those people. The lawsuit Lisa filed was modest by any reasonable standard. $10,000 if everything went perfectly in her favor, covering back wages, penalties, and compensation for the stress of having to pursue legal action. Most businesses would have settled immediately rather than rack up legal fees fighting over such a small amount. But for Stella and Jonathan, even that modest sum represented a threat they couldn't afford. According to what investigators would later uncover, they made a calculation that should chill anyone who believes in the basic value of human life. Rather than pay Lisa what they legally owed her, they decided to pay half that amount to have her killed. $5,000 to make their problem disappear permanently. $5,000 for a human life. After the termination, Lisa heard nothing from either Stella or Jonathan. No phone calls, no text messages, no attempts to resolve their differences privately. Stella had given birth by then, but she made no effort to reach out to someone who had once been close enough to attend family celebrations. The silence was deliberate, part of the larger plan to create distance before the final act. Lisa tried to focus on building her future rather than dwelling on workplace conflicts from the past. She'd been running an online clothing boutique since 2020, working from her apartment and building a modest but steady customer base. It was there, managing her online business, that she'd met Marcus, her current boyfriend, who'd joined her as a business partner and provided both emotional support and practical help with the day-to-day operations. The opportunity to open a physical storefront came through Marcus's brother John, who also happened to be Lisa's lawyer in the lawsuit against Cedar Valley Smiles. In October 2023, John and Marcus were driving through downtown Cedar Falls when they spotted a small retail space with a "For Lease" sign in the window. They immediately thought of Lisa, and her dreams of expanding beyond online sales. The rent was reasonable, the location had good foot traffic, and most importantly, John believed in Lisa's vision enough to offer financial backing. He'd seen her work ethic, witnessed her dedication to customer service, and understood that her biggest barrier to success wasn't talent or determination, it was capital. He offered to invest in the physical store with the understanding that Lisa would pay him back as the business grew. Bella's boutique opened its doors on October 20th, 2023, and Lisa threw herself into the work with the same intensity she brought to everything else in her life. She wasn't just running one business, she was juggling 3 different income streams to make ends meet. In addition to the boutique, she worked 12-hour shifts at a senior care facility, arriving at 6 in the morning and leaving at 6 in the evening. On weekends, she cleaned houses to bring in additional income. It was exhausting, but Lisa saw it as an investment in her future. Every dollar she earned brought her closer to financial independence, closer to being able to focus solely on growing her business. She was also saving money for a motorcycle, tired of depending on others for transportation, and wanting the freedom that came with having her own vehicle. "I'm working like crazy to at least get myself a donkey to ride around on," she'd joke with friends, using humor to mask the very real financial pressures she was facing. But she was optimistic about 2024, convinced that the new year would bring the breakthrough she'd been working toward. Lisa had no way of knowing that during those busy months of late 2023, someone was watching her every move. Someone was tracking her social media posts, monitoring her business activities, and gathering intelligence about her daily routines. Someone who had created a fake Instagram account specifically to spy on her without being detected. The account was registered under the name Fabian, with some additional numbers, designed to look like a typical social media profile belonging to a young man. Through this account, Stella could monitor Lisa's Instagram stories, track her location check-ins, and study her business hours without appearing on Lisa's list of viewers. It was sophisticated surveillance disguised as casual social media browsing. Lisa wasn't particularly active on social media during this period. She posted occasionally about the boutique because marketing was essential for business growth, but she wasn't the type to document every meal or share constant updates about her personal life. She rarely even checked to see who was viewing her stories, focused more on content creation than audience analysis. This lack of social media awareness worked in Stella's favor. Lisa had no idea she was being watched, no reason to suspect that someone was cataloging her routines and planning something sinister. The surveillance continued for months, building a detailed picture of Lisa's schedule and identifying the best opportunities for what was to come. New Year's Eve 2023 was particularly meaningful for Lisa. She traveled back to Millbrook to celebrate with her extended family, spending the evening at her aunt's house, surrounded by relatives she rarely got to see. There was dancing, laughter, and the kind of multi-generational bonding that creates lasting memories. Lisa's father, normally shy and reserved, joined in the dancing, creating moments that felt precious even as they were happening. Something about that celebration felt especially significant to Lisa. Maybe it was the realization that she was finally building the life she'd always wanted, or maybe it was simply the joy of being surrounded by people who loved her unconditionally. Whatever the reason, she found herself thinking about that evening constantly in the days that followed, posting throwback videos and photos with captions about how grateful she was for family and how much the evening had meant to her. "I need to experience this again," she told friends, describing an almost overwhelming desire to recreate that perfect night. Whether it was intuition or simple nostalgia, Lisa seemed to sense that such moments of pure happiness might be rare and should be treasured. For 12 days, Lisa lived in the afterglow of that celebration, posting memories and looking forward to everything 2024 might bring. She was planning to start her hospital internship as part of her nursing program, finally ready to return to school now that her business was stabilizing. She was saving for that motorcycle, dreaming about the freedom it would represent. She was building something meaningful with Marcus, both personally and professionally. She was, in every sense, a young woman with everything to live for. But on January 12, 2024, all of that optimism would be tested in ways she never could have imagined. Because while Lisa was building her future, Stella was finalizing plans to destroy it. The fake Instagram account became crucial in the final planning stages. Through Fabian, Stella began reaching out to Bella's boutique, posing as a potential customer who was specifically interested in being helped by a female employee. The request seemed reasonable enough. Some women prefer to shop for clothes with assistance from other women, especially when it comes to trying on items or discussing fit and style. But the timing of Fabian's inquiries was suspicious. The account holder claimed to have visited the store earlier in the week, only to find a male employee working instead of Lisa. This created a problem, Fabian explained, because she was self-conscious about her weight and uncomfortable changing clothes or discussing sizing with men present. Lisa was sympathetic to this concern and apologetic about the confusion. As a small business, they didn't have the luxury of maintaining consistent staffing, and sometimes either Marcus or John would cover the store when Lisa was at her other jobs. She assured Fabian that they were planning to hire additional female staff to prevent such situations in the future. More importantly, Lisa confirmed that she would be working alone on Friday, January 12th. She wanted to make sure Fabian had a positive shopping experience and was willing to adjust her schedule to ensure that happened. It was exactly the kind of customer service commitment that made Lisa successful as a business owner. But it also provided Stella with precisely the information she needed. The exchange sealed Lisa's fate. By confirming she would be alone in the store on Friday, Lisa had unknowingly scheduled her own death. She was organizing her week around providing excellent customer service, but she was actually organizing her week around making herself an easy target for professional killers. The irony would haunt investigators later. Lisa Anderson, who had spent years taking care of others and building a business based on trust and service, had been manipulated into ensuring her own vulnerability by someone she'd once considered a friend. As Friday, January 12th approached, everything was falling into place for Stella and Jonathan's plan. They had confirmed Lisa would be alone, identified the exact timing when she'd be most vulnerable, and arranged for the kind of violence that would send a message to anyone else who might consider crossing them. But they had fundamentally miscalculated something crucial about Lisa Anderson. They had observed her kindness and mistaken it for weakness. They had seen her willingness to help others and assumed it meant she wouldn't fight for herself. They had confused her trusting nature with naivety about the real dangers in the world. They were about to discover just how wrong they were about the young woman they thought they could eliminate without consequence. They were about to learn that some people, when faced with ultimate evil, find reservoirs of strength they never knew they possessed. And Lisa Anderson was about to prove that surviving isn't just about physical endurance. It's about the refusal to let evil win, no matter what the cost. Friday, January 12th, 2024, started like any other workday for Lisa. She arrived at Bella's boutique in the morning, unlocked the doors and settled into her routine of organizing inventory and preparing for customers. She had no way of knowing that her every movement was being monitored, that someone was tracking her communications and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Throughout the morning, Lisa maintained contact with Fabian through Instagram messages, providing updates about her schedule and confirming that she would be available to help with shopping. The conversation seemed routine, even thoughtful, a business owner making sure a customer felt welcomed and valued. But each message Lisa sent was actually providing intelligence to someone planning her death. "I'm here at the store," Lisa typed that morning, "waiting for you to arrive." The response came back quickly, confirmation that Fabian was still planning to come, asking Lisa to please keep her posted about when she'd be available. When lunchtime approached, Lisa followed her usual routine. She locked up the boutique temporarily and headed to the gym, something she did most days to maintain her physical and mental health. The workout was part of her daily rhythm, a way to manage stress and stay energized for the long hours she worked across multiple jobs. "Going to lunch and then the gym," she messaged Fabian. "I'll be back at 2 p.m. and stay until 6 p.m. Again, the immediate response asking for confirmation, emphasizing how expensive the trip would be and how important it was to coordinate timing perfectly. Lisa was accommodating, as always. She understood that some customers traveled significant distances to visit small boutiques, and she wanted to ensure Fabian had a positive experience. She had no idea she was providing a countdown to her own attempted murder. When Lisa returned from the gym that afternoon, she sent another update. "I'm back at the store now," but there was a practical problem she needed to address quickly. The boutique didn't have its own restroom, so Lisa had to use the facilities at the dental clinic next door whenever necessary. It was a minor inconvenience that she'd learned to manage, but it meant briefly leaving the store unattended. "I need to step out for just a few minutes to use the restroom," she messaged Fabian. "I'll be right back, so please let me know when you're close." The response was immediate and insistent. "Please keep me updated because I'm traveling a long distance and it's expensive. I don't want to make the trip for nothing." Lisa hurried to the clinic next door, used the restroom, and returned within 5 minutes. As she walked back into her boutique, she was looking down at her phone, typing a message to let Fabian know she was back and available. "I'm back now," she typed, still focused on the screen. When she looked up, 2 men were standing just inside her store. They weren't customers browsing merchandise or waiting politely by the entrance. They were positioned strategically, one near the door and another deeper in the store. And something about their presence immediately set off alarm bells in Lisa's mind. They were too still, too focused, too calculating in the way they were studying their surroundings. Later, investigators would analyze the security footage from that afternoon, and they'd see something chilling. One of the men looking directly into the camera, staring straight at the lens with the cold calculation of someone who knew exactly what he was about to do. It wasn't the nervous glance of someone planning a random robbery. It was the methodical assessment of a professional killer checking for witnesses and evidence. Lisa tried to maintain her professional demeanor, approaching them with the same customer service smile she offered everyone who entered her store. "Can I help you find something?" The taller man, who investigators would later identify as Jose Pedro, known as Paulista because of his São Paulo origins, acted as the spokesperson. "We're looking for clothes for a girlfriend," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "What size?" Lisa asked, moving toward the racks to show them options. "Large," Paulista replied. Lisa searched through her inventory, but she didn't have the specific style they'd requested in that size. "I'm sorry, I don't have that particular item in large right now," she explained apologetically. "But I could show you some similar options, or I could check when I might be getting more inventory." The response wasn't what she expected. Instead of accepting her explanation or asking about alternatives, Paulista insisted that she must have what they wanted. He kept pushing, kept demanding, kept trying to prolong their time in the store. Lisa began to realize that they weren't really interested in buying anything at all. That's when her survival instincts kicked in. Something was wrong with this situation, wrong with these men, wrong with their insistence on staying in her store when she'd already told them she didn't have what they claimed to want. She began to suspect this might be an attempted robbery, and she reached for her phone to alert Marcus or John to check the security cameras. The moment Lisa turned to grab her phone, everything changed. Paulista moved with the speed and efficiency of someone who had done this before. He grabbed her, pulling her close with violent force, and spoke the only words he would say during the entire attack. "You lost your chance to live." Then he began stabbing her. The first thrust of the knife came without warning, without negotiation, without any opportunity for Lisa to comply with demands or hand over money. This wasn't a robbery that had gone wrong. This was an execution that had been planned down to the smallest detail. Lisa's immediate fear wasn't just about death. Having survived childhood trauma, she was terrified that these men intended to assault her before killing her. The vulnerability of being alone with 2 violent strangers triggered memories and fears that went beyond the immediate physical threat to her life. But Lisa Anderson didn't just submit to what was happening. She fought. When the knife came toward her again, she grabbed the blade with her bare hands, trying to wrestle it away from her attacker. The metal sliced through her palms and fingers, cutting deep gashes that would require extensive surgery to repair. But she held on anyway. She was trading injury for the chance to stay alive. "You can rob me," she gasped, still believing this might be about money. "Please don't kill me. You can take whatever you want. Just let me live." But Paulista didn't respond. He didn't want her money or her merchandise. He wanted her dead, and he was being paid specifically to make that happen. The second attacker, later identified as Carlos, moved to restrain Lisa while Paulista continued the assault. But even with 2 men attacking her, Lisa refused to give up. She tried to use her legs to choke one of them, wrapping her lower body around Carlos's neck in a desperate attempt to disable him. The knife caught her shoe during this struggle, slicing through the leather, but missing her foot entirely. It was a stroke of luck that would later seem almost miraculous. If the blade had found flesh instead of synthetic material, she might have lost the ability to walk, let alone escape. The attack was relentless. Knife wounds accumulated across Lisa's neck, chest and torso as she continued fighting for her life. Blood was everywhere, soaking her clothes and pooling on the floor, but she refused to stop struggling. Her hands were destroyed from grabbing the blade repeatedly, but she kept trying to protect herself. Then, in the midst of the violence, something extraordinary happened. Lisa would later describe it as a spiritual intervention, a moment when she heard a voice telling her to stop fighting and pretend to be dead. Whether it was divine guidance, survival instinct, or simply the clarity that sometimes comes in life or death situations, she suddenly understood that continuing to fight would only ensure her death. She went limp, letting her body fall to the floor as if the injuries had finally overcome her. She controlled her breathing, kept her eyes nearly closed but open just enough to see what was happening, and waited. The ruse worked. Convinced that Lisa was finally dead, the attackers stopped stabbing her. But Paulista wasn't finished. He delivered one more thrust of the knife, making sure his victim was truly gone. Then he pressed his hand against the wound, driving the blade deeper into her body before finally pulling it out. Lisa lay motionless, fighting every instinct that screamed at her to move, to breathe normally, to respond to the pain that was overwhelming her nervous system. She watched through barely open eyes as the two men began staging a robbery, grabbing a purse from one of the mannequins, smashing the cash register, taking her phone and earbuds. They needed to make this look like a random crime, a small business robbery that had escalated tragically. The irony was devastating. These men were being paid $5,000 to kill Lisa, rather than allow her to collect the $10,000 she was seeking through the legal system. They were stealing her phone and a few dollars from the register to disguise a murder-for-hire plot, orchestrated by people Lisa had once trusted. When the attackers finally left, Lisa remained motionless for several crucial minutes. She needed to be absolutely certain they were gone before she risked moving or making any sound that might bring them back. The store fell silent except for the sound of her own labored breathing and the dripping of blood onto the floor. 25 stab wounds. That's what the medical team would count when Lisa finally reached the hospital. 17 wounds to her neck and torso alone, with additional cuts to her hands and arms from her desperate attempts to defend herself. The attack had been designed to ensure she couldn't survive, couldn't identify her attackers, couldn't tell anyone who had really ordered her death. But Lisa Anderson was still alive, broken, bleeding, traumatized beyond imagination, but alive. And that meant Stella and Jonathan's perfect crime had just become their perfect nightmare, because survivors tell stories, survivors remember details, and survivors can point investigators toward the truth, no matter how carefully that truth has been hidden. The two men who had carried out the attack had no idea that their victim was still breathing as they walked away from Bella's boutique that afternoon. They probably assumed they'd completed their contract successfully, that Lisa Anderson would be found dead in a few hours, and the case would be investigated as a random robbery gone wrong. They had no way of knowing that they'd just given Lisa the motivation to survive something that should have killed her, and that her survival would ultimately lead investigators straight back to the people who had hired them. The fight for Lisa's life was just beginning, but the most important battle had already been won. She was still alive, still conscious, and still determined to make sure that justice would eventually find everyone responsible for what had happened to her. But first, she had to find a way to get help before she bled to death on the floor of her own store. When the attackers finally left, they took a crucial step that revealed just how methodical their planning had been. They didn't just walk out of Bella's boutique. They carefully closed the curtains, locked the door from the inside, and left Lisa trapped without any means of communication. No phone, no way to call for help, no way to alert anyone that she was bleeding to death, just a few feet from a busy sidewalk. The isolation was complete and deliberate. This wasn't the hasty exit of panicked robbers who had accidentally killed someone. This was the calculated departure of professional killers who wanted to ensure their victim had no chance of survival, even if she'd somehow lived through the initial attack. Lisa lay motionless on the floor of her own store, listening to her own labored breathing and feeling her strength ebbing away with each drop of blood that pooled beneath her. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, she lost consciousness entirely. When she woke up, the pain was different than it had been during the attack. The adrenaline had worn off and her body was beginning to shut down from blood loss. The worst agony came from her legs, which felt cold and heavy as her circulation failed. She tried to shift position, instinctively wanting to lie face down as she normally did when sleeping, but when she rolled over, blood flowed from her neck wounds directly toward her mouth and nose. The realization hit her with terrifying clarity. If she stayed in that position, she would drown in her own blood. She forced herself to roll back over, despite the excruciating pain in her legs, and tried to find a position where she could breathe without aspirating blood. Lisa had no way of knowing how much time was passing. The store remained locked, the curtains drawn, and the world outside continued as if nothing had happened. But 40 minutes after the attack, something extraordinary occurred that would later seem like divine intervention. Michael, her neighbor who lived with schizophrenia, happened to notice something unusual near Lisa's store. Through a gap in the curtains, he caught a glimpse of blood, and immediately ran to tell his elderly mother that something was wrong with Lisa. His mother, who had treated Lisa like a daughter since she'd opened the boutique, became hysterical with worry. The elderly woman immediately sent her husband to call for emergency services, while she and other neighbors gathered outside the locked store. They could see evidence that something terrible had happened, but they couldn't get inside to help. The door was locked, the curtains were drawn, and there was no response when they called Lisa's name. That's when Lisa experienced what she would later describe as her second spiritual intervention of the day. Just as she'd heard a voice telling her to play dead during the attack, she now heard clear instructions to drag herself to the window and show the people outside that she was still alive. Using strength she didn't know she still possessed, Lisa pulled herself across the blood-soaked floor toward the front of the store. Every movement sent waves of agony through her wounded body, but she forced herself to keep going. She reached up and pulled back the curtain, then pressed her face against the glass window so the people outside could see her eyes and know she was still breathing. The reaction from the neighbors was immediate and dramatic. The elderly woman began sobbing with relief, while her husband frantically called for a locksmith to get the door open. Other residents gathered on the sidewalk, some crying, some shouting encouragement, all desperate to get inside and help. When Lisa pressed her face to that window, she was making a choice that would determine not just whether she lived or died, but whether justice would ever be served for what had been done to her. If she had remained hidden and died in that locked store, the case might have been investigated as a mysterious disappearance or a robbery gone wrong. But by revealing herself to witnesses, by showing that she was still alive, Lisa ensured that investigators would know this was an attempted murder. The locksmith arrived within minutes, and when emergency responders finally got inside the boutique, the scene was unlike anything most of them had ever encountered. Lisa was conscious but in severe shock from blood loss, surrounded by evidence of a violent struggle that had clearly been designed to end in death. The first responders were experienced professionals, but the amount of blood in that small store was staggering. It covered the floor, the walls, the merchandise, and had soaked through Lisa's clothing entirely. The initial assumption, given the number of visible wounds, was that someone had attempted to take their own life. "Why did you do this?" one of the elderly neighbors asked Lisa as paramedics worked to stabilize her. "You're so young and beautiful. Why would you hurt yourself like this?" From the neighbor's perspective, seeing someone covered in stab wounds in a locked store, it was a reasonable assumption. But Lisa, despite her weakened condition, was able to communicate clearly. "It was a robbery. 2 men robbed me." The distinction was crucial. This wasn't a case of self-harm or a mental health crisis. This was a violent crime that needed to be investigated immediately. Lisa remained conscious during the ambulance ride to Cedar Falls Regional Hospital, able to provide her name, social security number, and a basic description of what had happened. But when she arrived at the trauma center, her condition deteriorated rapidly. Blood loss and shock were overwhelming her system, and she arrived at the hospital essentially in a state of clinical death. What happened next would become legendary among the medical staff at Cedar Falls Regional. 30 healthcare professionals worked simultaneously to save Lisa's life, and not one of them could later explain exactly how they'd succeeded. The injuries were too extensive, the blood loss too severe, the damage to vital organs too significant for conventional medical intervention. The surgery lasted hours, with teams working to repair damage to Lisa's neck, chest, and hands, while simultaneously addressing the complications from severe blood loss. Her brain had swollen from oxygen deprivation, requiring the insertion of drainage tubes. Her left side was partially paralyzed from a hemorrhagic stroke caused by the blood loss. By every medical standard, Lisa Anderson should not have survived that night. but she did. 24 hours after the attack, Lisa began trying to wake up from the medically induced coma. This alarmed her medical team, who expected her to remain unconscious for much longer. When she continued showing signs of consciousness, they had to increase her sedation to keep her body stable while it healed. 6 days after the attack, Lisa finally woke up fully, and her first thought was confusion about why she was still alive. In her mind, the injuries she'd sustained were incompatible with survival. She'd expected to die in that store, and waking up in a hospital bed felt surreal, almost impossible. Her first visitor was Aunt Luana, her mother's sister, who had been like a second mother to Lisa throughout her life. When Lisa saw Luana approaching her bed, she realized she was truly alive. If she had died, Luana wouldn't be there to greet her in whatever came next. Despite being intubated and unable to speak, Lisa was completely lucid and remembered every detail of the attack. She asked for paper and a pen, and using her uninjured right hand, she wrote a message to her aunt. "I love you and I'm okay." It was the first sign that despite her physical injuries, Lisa's mind and spirit had remained intact. She had survived not just the attack, but the surgery and complications that followed. She was going to be able to tell her story. But even as Lisa was fighting for her life in the hospital, investigators were already working to uncover the truth about what had happened to her. The crime scene at Bella's boutique told a story that didn't match a typical robbery, and detectives were beginning to suspect that this attack was far more personal than it initially appeared. The first break in the case came when police arrested Marcelo Barboza, known locally as Marcelo the Tattoo Artist, who had been one of the two men in the store that day. Unlike Jose Pedro, who had wielded the knife, Marcelo's role had been to restrain Lisa and prevent her from escaping while the attack was carried out. When confronted with evidence linking him to the crime, Marcelo made a decision that would ultimately lead to the unraveling of the entire conspiracy. Rather than maintain his silence and face potential murder charges, he began cooperating with investigators, providing details about who had hired them and why. That's when the shocking truth began to emerge. This hadn't been a random crime or even a targeted robbery. This had been a murder-for-hire plot, orchestrated by people Lisa had trusted, people who had decided that paying killers was preferable to paying a legal settlement. Lisa learned these details gradually during her 15-day hospital stay, as family members and investigators shared pieces of information they thought she was strong enough to handle. The revelation that Stella and Jonathan had orchestrated the attack was devastating, but it also provided answers to questions that had been haunting her. Why had the attackers been so methodical and professional? Because they were hired killers who had been paid to ensure she died. Why had they staged a robbery? Because the people who hired them needed the attack to look random rather than personal. Why had they been so cold and emotionless? Because this was business to them, a contracted service they were providing for money. The investigation was expanding rapidly as police worked to build cases against everyone involved in the conspiracy. But the most important evidence in the entire case was walking around Cedar Falls Regional Hospital, recovering from injuries that should have been fatal, preparing to testify about what had been done to her and who was responsible. Lisa Anderson had survived 25 stab wounds, a stroke, and massive blood loss. She had awakened from a coma with her memory intact and her determination stronger than ever. She was going to make sure that everyone responsible for what happened to her would face justice. But first she had to finish healing. She had to regain the use of her left hand, had to build back the strength that had been drained from her body, had to prepare herself for the legal battles that lay ahead. The fight for Lisa's life was over. The fight for justice was just beginning. While Lisa was sedated in the intensive care unit, fighting for her life after multiple surgeries, the investigation into her attack was moving at lightning speed. Aunt Luana had tried to prepare her for what she'd learn when she woke up, gently explaining during Lisa's sedated state that the people responsible had been identified and arrested. "You're safe now," Luana whispered to her unconscious niece. "The police have caught everyone involved. It was Stella and Jonathan who did this to you." When Lisa finally woke up 6 days after the attack, she already knew the shocking truth about who had orchestrated her attempted murder. But knowing the facts intellectually was different from processing the emotional reality that someone she'd trusted as a friend had paid to have her killed. The first emotion Lisa felt wasn't anger or hatred. It was pity. She found herself thinking about Stella's baby daughter. about the little girl who would grow up knowing her mother had tried to have someone murdered. She worried about Stella's sisters, her mother, the extended family whose lives had been shattered by choices they'd had no part in making. Even from her hospital bed, recovering from 25 stab wounds, Lisa's first instinct was to feel compassion for the innocent people whose lives had been destroyed by Stella's actions. When her mother, Sarah, arrived at the hospital, Lisa was still intubated but desperate to communicate. She asked for paper and pen, and with her functioning right hand, she wrote out a message that would become central to her recovery. "Mom, I am consecrated to Our Lady of Aparecida. She appeared to me during the attack and stayed with me throughout everything." For Lisa, the spiritual dimension of her survival was as important as the medical miracle. She believed completely that divine intervention had saved her life, first by telling her to play dead during the attack, then by guiding her to the window so neighbors could see she was alive. But even in the midst of describing her spiritual experience, Lisa's thoughts returned to the people who had tried to kill her. "How is Stella's daughter?" she wrote to her mother. "What about her sisters? How is her family coping?" Sarah was amazed by her daughter's capacity for forgiveness and concern for others, even after what she'd endured. "Sweetheart, calm down," she responded. "What we can do is pray for them, pray for the baby, pray for the mother and sisters. Unfortunately, their reality has changed because of someone else's choices, and there's nothing we can do about that." The case had generated enormous media attention throughout the region. Lisa's survival against impossible odds, combined with the shocking revelation that her former employers had hired professional killers, created a story that captured public imagination. The hospital had to station police officers outside Lisa's room, not because she was in danger, but because so many people wanted to visit the miracle girl who had survived what should have been a fatal attack. During her 15-day hospital stay, Lisa learned more details about how the conspiracy had unfolded and how investigators had unraveled it so quickly. The break in the case had come when police arrested Marcelo Barbosa, the tattoo artist who had helped restrain Lisa during the attack. Faced with potential murder charges, Marcelo had decided to cooperate fully with investigators. Through Marcelo's confession, police learned that the murder plot had been much more complex than a simple disagreement between former employer and employee. The conspiracy involved at least 4 people, each playing a specific role in planning and executing Lisa's death. Stella and Jonathan had conceived the plan and provided the funding, but they'd needed intermediaries to connect them with professional killers. That's where Carlos Alberto, known as the German, had entered the picture. Carlos was a regular dental patient of Jonathan's, and during routine appointments, their conversations had somehow shifted from oral hygiene to much darker topics. Carlos was involved in local drug trafficking and had connections to people who could solve problems violently for the right price. When Jonathan mentioned his employee situation and expressed frustration about the pending lawsuit, Carlos had offered to help resolve the matter permanently. The financial arrangement was as cold-blooded as the crime itself. Jose Pedro, known as Paulista, would receive $1,000 plus forgiveness of his existing drug debt to Carlos. Marcelo would be paid a smaller amount for his support role. The total cost to Stella and Jonathan was approximately $5,000, exactly half of what Lisa was seeking through her lawsuit. The irony was devastating. Rather than pay Lisa the $10,000 she was legally entitled to, they'd chosen to pay half that amount to have her murdered. In their twisted logic, killing her was more cost-effective than settling the lawsuit. What investigators found most disturbing was the complete lack of sophisticated planning. The killers had made no attempt to study the location beforehand, hadn't researched escape routes, and seemed unaware that security cameras were recording their every move. Their motorcycle license plate was clearly visible on street cameras, and the boutique's internal camera system had captured the entire attack. The conversation with Fabian on Instagram had provided investigators with a clear record of how the conspirators had gathered intelligence about Lisa's schedule. The fake account had been traced directly back to Stella, providing undeniable evidence of premeditation. By the time Lisa was released from the hospital, 15 days after the attack, the entire conspiracy had been exposed, and all the primary participants were in custody. But for Lisa, learning the details of the plot was almost as traumatic as surviving the attack itself. The hardest part wasn't the physical recovery, although that was challenging enough. Lisa had suffered a hemorrhagic stroke from blood loss, leaving her left side partially paralyzed. She needed extensive physical therapy, speech therapy, occupational therapy, and psychological counseling. 5 different specialists were working with her to restore her physical and mental health. The hardest part was accepting that people she'd trusted had been capable of such calculated evil. During the court proceedings that followed, Lisa had hoped to see some genuine remorse from Stella and Jonathan, some acknowledgement of the enormity of what they'd done. Instead, she witnessed what she described as people who were sorry they'd been caught, not sorry they'd tried to have someone killed. They would be smarter next time, not less evil, Lisa concluded after watching them in court. They're not sorry they tried to kill me. They're sorry they got arrested. This realization was perhaps more painful than the physical wounds. Lisa had always believed in the fundamental goodness of people, had always been willing to give others the benefit of the doubt. Learning that her former friend had not only planned her death but felt no genuine remorse about it, challenged her faith in human nature. But Lisa was determined not to let their evil change who she was at her core. She made the decision to reopen Bella's boutique. Though she couldn't work there herself due to her ongoing medical treatment, she hired someone else to run the day-to-day operations while she focused on her recovery. The first time she returned to the store where she'd nearly died was emotionally significant. She wasn't sure how she'd react to being in the space where she'd fought for her life, where she'd lain bleeding and alone for 40 minutes, where she'd thought she was going to die. Instead of fear or trauma, Lisa felt overwhelming gratitude. Standing in that store, looking at the spot where she'd been attacked, she felt thankful to be alive, thankful for the neighbors who'd saved her, thankful for the medical team that had performed miracles to keep her breathing. One of the most meaningful moments in her recovery came when she was reunited with Michael, the neighbor with schizophrenia, who had first noticed the blood and alerted others that something was wrong. Despite his mental health challenges, Michael had been the crucial link in the chain of events that saved Lisa's life. When Lisa thanked him, Michael's response was simple and touching. "Let's get well so we can make money working here together." His grandmother, the elderly woman who had become hysterical when she learned Lisa was hurt, was overjoyed to see her recovered and walking around. "I'm so happy to see you well," the elderly woman said, tears in her eyes. "I've been praying for you every day." These moments of human kindness and genuine care stood in stark contrast to the calculated cruelty that Stella and Jonathan had shown. They reminded Lisa that while some people are capable of unimaginable evil, others are capable of extraordinary goodness. During interviews about her experience, Lisa was often asked about the moment when she thought she was dying, when she was looking death in the face and wondering what came next. Her response revealed the depth of her character and the strength that had allowed her to survive. "The pain in my legs was so intense that there was a moment when I just wanted it to stop," she admitted. "I wasn't necessarily afraid of dying, I just wanted the agony to end." But when asked what she missed most during her recovery, what she most wanted to do again, Lisa's answer surprised many people. It wasn't traveling or eating her favorite foods or seeing particular places. It was working. "I miss working so much," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "I had a motorcycle that I was so excited about, that I'd saved for and dreamed about. After the attack, they gave me a motorcycle to help with my transportation for treatment. But I can't ride it anymore. I try to get on it, but I can't do it. I used to be able to ride. I used to be able to do everything." The loss of her ability to work, to be fully independent, to pursue her dreams with the same energy she'd had before. These were the ongoing wounds that hurt more than any physical scar. But Lisa's determination to rebuild her life, her refusal to let the people who tried to kill her destroy her dreams, and her capacity to feel gratitude rather than bitterness made her survival story about much more than just staying alive. It became a testament to the power of the human spirit to overcome even the most calculated attempts to destroy it. The legal proceedings were ongoing, but for Lisa, the most important victory had already been won. She was alive, she was healing, and she was proof that evil doesn't always triumph, no matter how carefully it's planned or how much money backs it up. Stella and Jonathan had wanted to silence her permanently. Instead, they'd given her a story that would inspire others and ensure that their crimes would never be forgotten. They'd tried to end her life, but they'd actually given her a platform to show the world what real strength looks like. The physical scars from the attack were only part of Lisa's recovery journey. The emotional and practical challenges of rebuilding her life proved to be just as daunting as surviving 25 stab wounds. One of the immediate problems Lisa faced was housing. She'd been sharing an apartment with 2 female roommates when the attack occurred, but the trauma of what had happened to their friend was too much for them to handle. They moved out immediately, leaving Lisa without a place to live when she was discharged from the hospital. "I had always dreamed of having my own house," Lisa explained months later, sitting in a modest rental home. "And now I have a house, but it's not really mine. It's rented. I had to give up the place I was living because my roommates were so traumatized by what happened that they couldn't stay." John, her lawyer and Marcus's brother, had stepped up in an extraordinary way during this crisis. Despite having his own family and responsibilities, he'd opened his home to Lisa and her mother, providing them with a safe place to recover while Lisa underwent extensive medical treatment. "He gave us his own bedroom," Lisa said, her voice filled with gratitude. "My mother and I stayed in his room, while my other family members and friends who were helping take care of me used other parts of the house. He has good financial resources, thank God, because of his hard work and success, and he was willing to share all of that with us during the worst time of our lives. The generosity was particularly meaningful because it came with no strings attached, no expectation of repayment, just human kindness in the face of unimaginable circumstances." But even with a roof over her head, Lisa struggled with the most basic activities of daily living. The nerve damage in her left hand, combined with ongoing effects from her stroke, made simple tasks impossibly difficult. "I can't wash a single dish," she admitted. "I can't clean my house, can't take care of myself the way I always did. Everything has to be done for me, and that's so hard when you've always been independent." For someone who had defined herself through work, through taking care of others, through being productive and self-sufficient, this dependence on others was perhaps the cruelest part of her recovery. Just when Lisa thought she was making progress in her healing, another medical crisis emerged that was almost as serious as the original attack. During a routine follow-up appointment, her vascular surgeon discovered something alarming that had been missed during her initial treatment. The trauma from the stabbing had damaged her right vertebral artery and created an aneurysm that was blocking blood flow to her brain. The situation was made even more dangerous by the fact that Lisa's left vertebral artery had never developed properly. It was too small to carry sufficient blood to her brain under normal circumstances. "The doctor asked me how I was still alive," Lisa recalled. "He said with a hemorrhagic stroke and now this blocked artery, I should have been dead. He called it a ticking time bomb." Lisa's mother, who had maintained unwavering faith throughout her daughter's ordeal, responded to the surgeon's amazement with characteristic directness. "Doctor, you still don't understand that this is God's work. This is a miracle, and it's not being performed by any person. God doesn't want her to die." The discovery led to 2 more surgeries, adding to the already overwhelming medical expenses and extending Lisa's recovery timeline indefinitely. For her mother, who had been sleeping on hospital floors and living in constant fear of losing her daughter, it was almost too much to bear. But once again, Lisa survived what should have been a fatal condition. The neurosurgeon was able to address the aneurysm and restore blood flow to her brain, though the recovery would require months of additional therapy and careful monitoring. When asked about her long-term prognosis and when she might be able to return to work, ride her motorcycle or complete her nursing degree, Lisa's medical team remained cautiously optimistic but realistic about the challenges ahead. "Everything in its own time," her doctors told her, a phrase that had become both a source of hope and frustration for someone accustomed to setting goals and working tirelessly to achieve them. The neurologist had given Lisa medical clearance to resume normal activities, but psychologically she wasn't ready. The discovery of the aneurysm had triggered a new kind of fear, the realization that she could die suddenly, without warning, despite surviving the original attack. "I've become more cautious, maybe too cautious," she acknowledged. "When you discover you could have died again, it makes you afraid of taking risks." This fear extended to her beloved motorcycle, the vehicle she'd saved for and dreamed about for so long. Though she'd been given a replacement motorcycle to help with transportation to medical appointments, she found herself unable to ride it. "I can get on it and try to work the clutch, but I can't quite close my hand completely around it yet," she explained, demonstrating the limited range of motion in her left hand. "I keep trying, but I'm not quite there." The partial paralysis was a constant reminder of how close she'd come to death, how much her life had changed, how many dreams remained unfulfilled. But Lisa refused to define herself by her limitations. When asked what message she would send to Stella, Jonathan, and the others who had conspired to kill her, her response revealed both her pain and her remarkable capacity for forgiveness. "I want them to have broken hearts," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. "They have families, mothers and fathers, and they never thought about the pain their own parents would feel. They never considered what their children would have to live with. I want them to understand what they've done, to truly repent, and to accept responsibility instead of trying to get away with it." Lisa was particularly heartbroken for Stella's infant daughter, who was only 5 months old when her mother was arrested for conspiracy to commit murder. "They chose this path for her," Lisa said. "That little girl had no choice in any of this, but she'll be affected for the rest of her life. They were celebrating new life with their baby, while planning to take away mine. How do you hold both of those things in your heart at the same time?" The legal proceedings were moving slowly through the court system. All 5 conspirators, Stella, Jonathan, Carlos, the German, Jose Pedro, Paulista, and Marcelo, the tattoo artist, had been charged with criminal conspiracy and attempted murder. Because the charges included attempted murder, the case would eventually go before a jury trial, but that process could take months or even years. For Lisa, the slow pace of justice was frustrating, but she remained confident that the truth would ultimately prevail. She testified during preliminary hearings, facing her attackers in court and telling her story directly to the people who had tried to silence her forever. "I could see in their faces that they're sorry they got caught, not sorry they tried to kill me," she observed. "If they could go back in time, they'd be smarter about how they did it, not less evil." Despite everything she'd endured, Lisa was determined to find meaning and purpose in her survival. She decided to sell her beloved motorcycle to help pay for her ongoing medical expenses, a decision that broke her heart, but demonstrated her practical approach to her new reality. "The motorcycle was a gift and I loved it, but it can't pay for even a third of what my treatment costs," she explained. "So Marcus and I decided to sell it to help cover my expenses, but even this sacrifice became an opportunity to help others." When Lisa delivered the motorcycle to its new owner, she learned that the buyer was a woman who had been struggling without reliable transportation, facing daily humiliation because she couldn't afford a vehicle for herself and her daughter. "I was so happy to be able to help someone else," Lisa said. "Even in the middle of my own struggles, I could still make a difference for another person." The decision to sell the motorcycle also represented something deeper, Lisa's growing acceptance that her life would be different from what she'd planned, but that different didn't necessarily mean worse. "I get on the motorcycle sometimes and practice working the clutch," she said. "I can almost close my hand completely around it now. I can dance a little bit of foro slowly and carefully. I'm getting stronger every day." The woman who had fought off 2 armed attackers with her bare hands, who had survived 25 stab wounds and multiple life-threatening complications, who had awakened from a coma with her memory and determination intact, was now learning to celebrate smaller victories, the gradual return of sensation in her left hand, the ability to dance slowly with her father, the growing strength that might one day allow her to ride a motorcycle again. Lisa Anderson had been forced to redefine what success meant, what happiness looked like, what dreams were worth pursuing, but she'd maintained the essential qualities that had made her such a remarkable person before the attack: her compassion for others, her determination to work and contribute, her refusal to let evil define her story. The people who had tried to kill her had wanted to silence her voice, end her dreams, and erase her presence from the world. Instead, they created a survivor whose story would inspire others and whose strength would serve as a testament to the power of the human spirit to overcome even the most calculated attempts to destroy it. The legal battle would continue, the physical recovery would take time, and the emotional healing might last a lifetime. But Lisa Anderson was alive, she was fighting, and she was proof that some lights are too bright to be extinguished, no matter how much darkness tries to overwhelm them. The final chapter of Lisa Anderson's story isn't about endings, it's about beginnings. Because for every attempt to destroy her spirit, Lisa found a way to transform her pain into purpose, her survival into service, her trauma into triumph. The sale of her beloved motorcycle became more than just a financial necessity. It became a symbol of how Lisa had chosen to navigate her new reality. Instead of mourning what she'd lost, she focused on what she could give. The woman who bought the motorcycle had been facing daily humiliation because she couldn't afford reliable transportation for herself and her daughter. When Lisa handed over the keys, she wasn't just selling a vehicle, she was changing someone's life. It felt so good to help someone else, Lisa explained, her voice filled with genuine joy despite everything she'd been through. Despite all the pain and problems I could be focusing on, being able to change someone's reality for the better is incredibly satisfying. To give someone else the dream I'd had of having a motorcycle, it means everything to me. This act of generosity represented something profound about who Lisa Anderson had become through her ordeal. The attack had been designed to silence her, to end her capacity to impact others, to remove her voice from the world. Instead, it had amplified her ability to inspire and help people in ways she never could have imagined before. Lisa had made the difficult decision to organize raffles and fundraising events to cover her ongoing medical expenses. The treatments she needed weren't covered by Brazil's public health system or private insurance, leaving her family to bear the enormous financial burden of her recovery. Physical therapy, speech therapy, occupational therapy, psychological counseling, specialized medical equipment. The costs mounted daily with no end in sight. "I'll probably need to organize another raffle soon," she admitted. "I don't have any prediction of when my treatment will end. Even when it does, I've been advised not to return to the kind of intensive work schedule I had before. It was too exhausting, too demanding for someone with my current limitations." The reality was stark, but Lisa faced it with characteristic determination. Her income now came entirely from the generosity of others, family members, friends, and strangers who had been moved by her story and wanted to support her recovery. For someone who had always defined herself through work, through independence, through providing for herself, this dependence was perhaps the hardest adjustment of all. The legal proceedings continued to move slowly through Brazil's justice system. The workplace lawsuit that had triggered the murder conspiracy was still pending, complicated by the defendants' claims that they hadn't been properly notified of court dates because they were incarcerated. The criminal trial for attempted murder and conspiracy would take even longer to resolve, potentially stretching on for years. They tried to claim they weren't notified about hearings, but they were, Lisa said, frustration evident in her voice. "It's the same pattern. They tried to kill me over that lawsuit, and now they're trying to avoid responsibility for everything they've done." But Lisa had learned not to pin her hope for healing on the outcomes of legal proceedings. Her recovery, her peace of mind, her ability to move forward, these couldn't be held hostage to the glacial pace of courtroom justice. Marcus had been her anchor throughout the entire ordeal, the person who had literally kept her dreams alive when she couldn't pursue them herself. He'd managed Bella's boutique when she was hospitalized, supported her through multiple surgeries, and even proposed marriage while she was still intubated in the intensive care unit. Marcus wrote on a piece of paper, asking me to marry him when I couldn't speak, Lisa recalled with a smile. I wrote back, yes, but then I told him, I want a ring and a party and dancing at our wedding. They had tentatively planned their wedding for February 31st, a date that doesn't exist, which had become a running joke between them. We're not really going to get married on a day that doesn't exist, Lisa laughed. But now that everyone knows he proposed, people are going to start asking when the wedding is happening. The relationship had been tested in ways that most couples never face. Marcus had seen Lisa at her most vulnerable, had helped her through the darkest period of her life, had committed to a future with someone whose limitations and needs had changed dramatically. His unwavering support had become one of the brightest lights in Lisa's recovery journey. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Lisa's story was her continued ability to see beyond her own circumstances, to recognize that her survival had given her a platform to inspire others and advocate for victims of violence. She understood that her voice carried weight precisely because she had nearly lost it forever. I want to be able to give voice to others, she explained, not just for myself, but so people can see something bigger than just one person's tragedy. I want my story to matter for others who are fighting their own battles. This perspective transformed Lisa from victim to advocate, from survivor to spokesperson, for the proposition that evil doesn't always win, that calculated cruelty can be overcome by genuine goodness, that the human spirit possesses reserves of strength that can't be measured or predicted. The investigation into her case had revealed the shocking coldness of the conspiracy against her. Stella and Jonathan had chosen to pay $5,000 to have her killed, rather than $10,000 to settle her legitimate workplace claims. They had celebrated the birth of their daughter while planning the death of their former employee. They had used their professional connections to find killers and their business resources to fund murder. But their perfect crime had failed because they had fundamentally misunderstood who Lisa Anderson was. They had seen someone they thought was weak, naive, expendable. They had encountered someone who possessed an inner strength that no amount of violence could break. The physical scars from 25 stab wounds would fade with time. The neurological damage from her stroke would improve with therapy. The financial pressures would eventually resolve. But the transformation that had occurred in Lisa's understanding of her own purpose, her own strength, her own capacity to impact the world, that was permanent. She had learned that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about refusing to let evil define your story. It's about finding ways to help others, even when you're struggling yourself. It's about maintaining faith in human goodness, despite encountering human evil at its most calculated and cruel. Lisa Anderson had been attacked by people who wanted to erase her from the world. Instead, they had ensured that her story would be told wherever people gathered to discuss resilience, justice, and the power of the human spirit to overcome even the most determined attempts to destroy it. The young woman who had opened Bella's boutique with dreams of financial independence and professional success had become something much more significant, a symbol of hope for anyone who has ever felt powerless against the forces arrayed against them. As investigators closed their files on the case and prosecutors prepared for trial, as Lisa continued her therapy and slowly regained strength in her left hand, as Marcus planned a wedding celebration that would honor not just their love, but Lisa's survival, one truth had become crystal clear. Some lights shine so brightly that no amount of darkness can extinguish them. Some spirits are so strong that violence only makes them stronger. Some voices are so important that attempts to silence them only amplify their message. Lisa Anderson was living proof that evil, no matter how carefully planned or well-funded, cannot destroy a person who refuses to be destroyed. Her story would outlast her attackers' crimes, her voice would carry farther than their hatred, and her impact would endure long after their attempts to silence her had been forgotten. The case of the 25 stabbings was officially solved, but the story of Lisa Anderson's triumph over evil was just beginning. Because sometimes, the most powerful response to calculated cruelty is simply to keep living, keep helping others, and keep believing that goodness will ultimately prevail. And Lisa Anderson intended to keep proving that truth, one day at a time, for the rest of her life.